Welcome to this deep dive. We're here to sift through the information you've provided and pull out the key insights.
That's right.
Today, we're digging into a discussion from Bergsma, the YouTube show. The aim is to unpack some, well, pretty significant shifts happening in Dutch politics and, society.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be looking at Pieter Omtzigt's departure, the commentary around that, the really tough case involving Seb van Lier, and then a bit on a discussion with Mattias Desmet about mass formation.
And it feels like these aren't isolated incidents, right? They seem connected, reflecting some deeper tensions bubbling up in the Netherlands.
Exactly. They all seem to tap into the current mood somehow.
Absolutely. Each piece, the politicians stepping back, the father's very public pain, this theory about how society shifts, gives us a different window onto what's going on.
So where should we start? Omtzigt.
Yeah, let's start there. The host of Bergsma had this take on why Omtzigt, quote, had to leave. The core argument seems to label him a procedure ideologue. What does that actually mean in this context?
Okay, yeah. Procedure ideologue. It's quite a term. From the source, it suggests Omtzigt puts maybe an extremely high value on the process itself.
Right.
Due process, rule of law, sticking to the democratic playbook, step by step.
Which sound like good things, generally speaking.
Of course, yeah. But the argument presented is that this intense focus on how things get done started to clash with what the new right-wing cabinet actually wants to do.
Right. The feeling presented is that this new government wants to deliver results on its main promises. Think immigration, supporting farmers, and they want to do it fast.
So Omtzigt's careful step-by-step approach.
Exactly. It was seen, according to his perspective, as slowing things down, delaying what the host calls these good plans.
Was there a specific example given?
Yes. The spreading swipe, that law about distributing asylum seekers.
Ah, okay.
The argument was that Omtzigt, digging into the details, focusing heavily on the Council of State's advice, that was seen as typical of him obstructing the cabinet's desire for, quick, decisive action.
So it wasn't that he wasn't thorough. He's known as a dossierwriter, someone who really gets into the files.
Precisely. That reputation is still there. But the argument is that this very thoroughness, his procedural focus, just didn't fit with a cabinet that wants to be seen as a doing cabinet.
An action cabinet.
Yeah, an door-pat cabinet.
Yeah.
One that pushes things through forcefully. His style became a perceived liability for that kind of governing.
So the conclusion drawn is a clash. Procedure versus content.
That's the narrative presented. Omtzigt represents the procedure, the meticulous process. The new coalition represents the content, the policy agenda they want enacted now.
And the suggestion is the cabinet prioritized the what over the how.
That seems to be the interpretation, yeah.
Yeah.
Prioritizing speed and results, maybe even if it means streamlining processes that Omtzigt would have insisted on following to the letter. It raises big questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About balancing process and action.
It really does. And that focus on procedure versus outcome leads us into something much heavier, doesn't it? The case of Seb van Lier.
Yes. A deeply, deeply upsetting situation described in the source material. Comes from Uden in North Brabant.
Can you outline what was presented? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. The transcript details Seb van Lier's story. His 15-year-old daughter was allegedly raped by a Syrian asylum seeker. And Mr. van Lier apparently gave this very emotional, very raw testimony at a local commission meeting.
Wow.
And that moment, it seems, really resonated. It's presented as crystallizing this feeling of a huge gap between politicians, the system, and what ordinary people are actually going through. Their fears, their pain.
The total disconnect.
That's how it's framed. It's seen as a point where the social contract feels broken. Citizens feel the system meant to protect them is more concerned with its own rules than with their safety. That breeds serious distrust.
And the Bergsma host explicitly links this back to Omtzigt.
The suggestion made is that Omtzigt's focus on procedure, while perhaps valuable in scrutinizing past failures like the Toeslagen affair, ultimately didn't connect with, or maybe couldn't address, this kind of raw public anger and suffering represented by the Van Lier case.
So the criticism extends beyond just Omtzigt to the authorities in general.
Yes, the criticism outlined is that authorities, local council, national politics are perceived by some as getting lost in regulations and procedures, losing sight of the human cost.
Right.
In the Van Lier situation, the transcript mentions immense frustration with how local authorities responded or allegedly failed to respond adequately. There are even claims the family felt treated like they were the problem.
And allegations that someone tried to silence them.
Yes, that the municipality allegedly tried to get the therapist to advise Van Lier not to speak out publicly.
That's quite an accusation.
It is. And Van Lier's own reported questions are just devastatingly direct. Asking the council about his daughter's safety, asking if they just wanted the story to go away.
It paints a picture of feeling completely abandoned by the system.
Absolutely. And then on top of everything, Mr. Van Lier himself was arrested later, portrayed in some media, according to the source, as a troublemaker for advocating for his child.
Unbelievable.
The sentiment captured in the source is that people generally accept rules and procedures, right? But that acceptance vanishes when those same procedures seem to protect perpetrators or lead to injustice and harm hitting close to home.
When the process itself feels like the problem.
Exactly. The human pain becomes overwhelming and the procedures seem secondary or even insulting.
And the host contrasts this visceral public anger with what? Things happening in The Hague.
Yeah, with perceived distractions, like mentions of arguments over the cost of a party venue for the outgoing Prime Minister Rutte. It's used to highlight this perceived gulf between the priorities of the political class and the urgent, painful realities facing citizens like the Van Liers.
So Van Leer's case becomes this potent symbol of that clash procedure versus the human reality.
That's precisely how it's framed in the Bachy-Met-Bergsma discussion. A moment where the political machinery seems utterly detached from real human suffering.
Okay. Then the conversation pivots slightly, looking ahead to a discussion with Professor Mattias Desmet on mass formation. What's the core issue previewed there?
Right, mass formation. Desmet's theory about how large groups can become sort of hypnotized by a particular narrative. The key point of disagreement highlighted by the host seems to be about the role of elites or drivers in this process.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, the host seems to argue that while, sure, some people in power might genuinely believe the dominant narratives, climate change is the biggest threat or Russia is or whatever the narrative is, there are also conscious actors, brains, as the host puts it, actively shaping these narratives, maybe manipulating things.
So a more top-down, deliberate shaping of opinion.
That seems to be the host's leaning, yes.
Yeah.
As opposed to what the host understands Desmet's view to be.
And what is that view, according to the host?
The interpretation presented is that Desmet sees these elites as also being caught up in the mass formation themselves. Like, they're also somewhat hypnotized by the ideology they're pushing.
Interesting. So are they driving it consciously, or are they swept along too?
That's the core question raised, isn't it? Is it intentional direction or more of a collective phenomenon that engulfs leaders as well? And understanding that difference is pretty crucial for figuring out how to respond.
The host brings up the example of the lack of evaluation of COVID facts. How does that fit in?
That's mentioned as potential evidence for the deliberate obstruction argument. The idea being that information contradicting the main narrative was actively suppressed, which suggests conscious control rather than just everyone being swept along.
And the host mentions their own legal perspective.
Yeah, bringing in this idea of individual responsibility, holding people accountable, which seems to sit a bit uneasily with a view of mass formation that might suggest reduced individual agency, perhaps.
Sort of everyone was just caught up in it. Defense.
Potentially, yeah. The host seems skeptical of letting individuals off the hook, emphasizing accountability. There's also a mention of how psychopathic individuals in power might exploit these mass formation dynamics.
Which adds another layer of complexity.
Definitely. And importantly, the host emphasizes wanting to analyze these things beyond simple left versus right political boxes.
That seems crucial. These phenomena might not fit neatly into those old categories.
Exactly. The host suggests looking at things through lenses like mass formation might offer deeper insights than just sticking to traditional political divides.
So wrapping this up, what are the main threads, the key tensions that emerge from this whole discussion we've unpacked?
I think there are a few major ones. First, that real friction between governing procedure and the political pressure for immediate action and results.
Okay.
Second, this alarming disconnect between the formal political world and the lived, often painful, emotional realities of citizens, starkly shown by the Van Lier case.
Right, the human cost.
And third, these differing views on why society shifts as it does. The mass formation debate, the role of elites, is it deliberate control or collective hypnosis, or maybe a mix of both?
Yeah.
These all point towards some pretty fundamental questions about trust, about how governance works, and maybe where the Netherlands is heading.
So thinking about all the procedure versus action tension, the citizen disconnect, the uncertainty about societal drivers, it leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? What does effective governance and maybe meaningful civic engagement even look like in the Netherlands right now?
It really does.
Oh,
How do you balance essential rules with urgent human needs? How do people make their voices heard when the system feels distant or unresponsive? And how do we all navigate these powerful societal currents and narratives? Lots to think about.
absolutely. Well, if this deep dive has sparked your interest, definitely check out the full Backing at Bergsma episode or look into Matthias Desmet's work. There's clearly a lot more depth there. Thanks for joining us.